October 24th, 1990. Rome, Italy. The Italian parliament is unusually quiet. Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti, a man who has survived decades of political storms, stands at the podium. He looks tired, his face a mask of bureaucratic indifference. But as he begins to speak, he drops a nuclear bomb on the collective consciousness of Europe. He admits it. He admits that for 40 years, a secret army has existed in the shadows of the Italian state, an army that was never authorized by Parliament, an army trained by the CIA and MI6, an army with hidden weapon caches under gardens, cemeteries, and churches. Its name, Gladio, the sword. Within weeks, the dominoes begin to fall. Belgium admits to a secret army. France admits it. Holland, Greece, and Turkey, they all have them. They were meant to be the stay-behind units to fight a Soviet invasion that never came. But as the investigations deepen, a terrifying question emerges. If there was no Soviet invasion, what were these soldiers doing for 40 years? Imagine waking up to find that your democracy was a stage play, and the real power was held by men in masks who were willing to kill their own citizens to protect them. Would you still feel safe? Or would you realize that the Cold War was actually a hot war fought in the shadows of your own streets? To understand Gladio, we must return to the ash and rubble of 1945. World War II had ended, but for the strategists in Washington and London, the nightmare was just beginning. The Red Army was sitting in Berlin. Half of Europe was under the Soviet boot, and in Western Europe, especially Italy and France, communist parties were winning elections. The fear in the CIA's newly formed headquarters was absolute. What if the Soviets don't need a war? What if they just win through the ballot box? The solution was a secret protocol signed within NATO. Every member state was to establish a stay-behind organization. These were to be elite, clandestine networks of patriots, civilians, soldiers, and spies who would disappear into the woods if the Soviet tanks rolled in. They would be the resistance. They would be the ghosts in the machine. But there was a catch. To be a patriot in this secret world, you had to be a fanatical anti-communist. And in the 1940s and 50s, the most fanatical anti-communists were the men who had just lost the war. The former fascists, the Nazi collaborators, and the ultra-right-wing militants. The CIA didn't care about their past. They only cared about their loyalty to the future. Imagine a quiet suburban garden in the outskirts of Verona, or a remote forest in the Belgian Ardennes in 1955. The air is damp with the smell of pine needles and decaying leaves. Underneath a nondescript patch of earth, buried 6 feet deep, lies a heavy, zinc-lined crate. Inside that crate, preserved in thick cosmoline grease, is a treasure trove of death. Beretta submachine guns, blocks of C4 plastic explosive, encrypted radio sets, and bundles of untraceable US dollars. You can hear the rhythmic thud-thud of a shovel as a stay-behind agent, perhaps the local priest or a quiet school teacher, checks the cache in the middle of the night. The metal is cold to the touch. The scent of the grease is sharp and chemical, a smell that means war. These men lived dual lives. By day, they were fathers, workers, and neighbors. By night, they were shadows. They were trained in secret camps in Sardinia or the UK, learning how to blow up bridges, how to assassinate political leaders, and how to create chaos. They weren't just waiting for the Soviets. They were being kept in a state of high-tension readiness. The radios hummed with static, waiting for a code word that might never come. But while they waited, their purpose began to shift. They stopped looking at the East and started looking at their own neighbors. By the late 1960s, the world was changing. Students were protesting in the streets. Labor unions were striking. The left was becoming powerful. For the secret architects of Gladio, this wasn't democracy, it was a security breach. They decided to activate a new doctrine, the strategy of tension. If the people were moving toward communism, the people needed to be made afraid of it. They needed to be shocked back into the arms of the state. How do you make a nation terrified of a political party? You bomb a bank, you blow up a train, and you make sure the world thinks the other side did it. December 12, 1969, Milan, Italy. The National Agricultural Bank in Piazza Fontana is crowded with farmers and businessmen. The air smells of espresso and old paper. Suddenly, at 4:37 p.m., the world turns into a roar of white heat and flying glass. The explosion is so violent it tears a hole in the floor. 17 people are killed instantly. The sound is a deafening, ringing silence that follows the blast. You can taste the dust, acrid, gritty, and thick in your throat. You hear the screams of the survivors, but they sound far away, as if they are underwater. Within hours, the police arrest an anarchist named Giuseppe Pinelli. The newspapers scream, "Communist terror," but it was a lie. Years later, it would be revealed that the bomb was planted by Ordine Nuovo, a neo-fascist group with deep ties to the Gladio network. The goal wasn't just to kill, it was to create a climate of fear that would justify a law and order crackdown. This was the strategy of tension in its purest form. Every drop of blood in Piazza Fontana was a calculated political move. The shadow soldiers were no longer protecting the state, they were attacking the people to save the system. While Italy was burning in the years of lead, another arm of the secret network was operating with even more lethal efficiency. In Turkey, the stay-behind unit was the Special Warfare Department. But in the coffee houses and the dark alleys of Ankara and Istanbul, it had a different name, the Counter-Guerrilla. Turkey was the ultimate prize in the Cold War. It was the only NATO member sharing a border with the Soviet Union. The CIA's involvement here was deeper, more aggressive, and more militarized. The counter-guerrilla wasn't just a resistance unit, it was the deep state. Imagine a clandestine meeting in a luxury hotel in Istanbul in 1971. Outside, the fog is rolling off the Bosporus, gray and suffocating. Inside the room, the air is thick with the scent of Turkish coffee and expensive tobacco. A U.S. intelligence officer sits across from a Turkish general. On the table between them is a list of names, journalists, student leaders, labor organizers. You can hear the clink of the coffee cup against the saucer. It's a polite sound, but the conversation is about murder. The counter-guerrilla utilized civilian elements, ultra-nationalist militants, to do the dirty work. They were given weapons from secret NATO caches. They were given immunity. When the 1971 and 1980 coups occurred, the shadow soldiers were the ones preparing the ground. The 1977 May Day massacre in Taksim Square, where 34 people died in a hail of bullets from unknown snipers, bore all the hallmarks of the strategy of tension. The goal was to make the country ungovernable so that the military could step in as saviors. How do you fight an enemy that has no face, no uniform, and is funded by your own taxes? 1978. The climax of the Italian nightmare. Aldo Moro, the former prime minister and leader of the Christian Democrats, is close to achieving the historic compromise, bringing the Communist Party into a coalition government. For the Gladio network and the CIA, this was the ultimate red line. If Moro succeeded, Italy would be lost to the east. On March 16th, Moro is kidnapped in a military-style ambush in Rome. All 5 of his bodyguards are killed. For 55 days, Italy holds its breath. Moro's letters from his people's prison beg for a negotiation. The state refuses. On May 9th, his body is found in the trunk of a car, symbolically parked halfway between the headquarters of the Christian Democrats and the Communist Party. The Red Brigades claimed the kill, but decades of evidence suggest that Gladio and the P2 Masonic Lodge, a secret parallel government, ensured that Moro was never found. They needed him dead to kill the compromise. The shadow soldiers had achieved their mission. The coalition was dead. The status quo was saved. But at what cost to the truth? We move from the streets of Rome to the high-tech bunkers of NATO headquarters. It is 1983. The Cold War is at a breaking point. President Reagan has called the USSR the evil empire. NATO is preparing for a massive exercise, Able Archer 83. Within hours, the police arrest an anarchist named Giuseppe Pinelli. The newspapers scream, "Communist terror!" But it was a lie. Years later, it would be revealed that the bomb was planted by Ordine Nuovo, a neo-fascist group with deep ties to the Gladio network. The goal wasn't just to kill, it was to create a climate of fear that would justify a law and order crackdown. This was the strategy of tension in its purest form. Every drop of blood in Piazza Fontana was a calculated political move. The shadow soldiers were no longer protecting the state, they were attacking the people to save the system. While Italy was burning in the years of lead, another arm of the secret network was operating with even more lethal efficiency. In Turkey, the stay-behind unit was the Special Warfare Department, but in the coffee houses and the dark alleys of Ankara and Istanbul, it had a different name, the Counter-Guerrilla. Turkey was the ultimate prize in the Cold War. It was the only NATO member sharing a border with the Soviet Union. The CIA's involvement here was deeper, more aggressive, and more militarized. The counter-guerrilla wasn't just a resistance unit, it was the deep state. Imagine a clandestine meeting in a luxury hotel in Istanbul in 1971. Outside, the fog is rolling off the Bosphorus, gray and suffocating. Inside the room, the air is thick with the scent of Turkish coffee and expensive tobacco. A U.S. intelligence officer sits across from a Turkish general. On the table between them is a list of names: journalists, student leaders, labor organizers. You can hear the clink of the coffee cup against the saucer. It's a polite sound, but the conversation is about murder. The counter-guerrilla utilized civilian elements, ultra-nationalist militants, to do the dirty work. They were given weapons from secret NATO caches. They were given immunity. The Soviets, watching the secret communications of the stay-behind networks, became convinced that this wasn't an exercise. They thought it was a cover for a real nuclear strike. The shadow soldiers were at high alert. The weapon caches were being checked. The radios were buzzing. For 10 days, the world sat on the edge of a nuclear holocaust because the secrecy of these networks had created a feedback loop of paranoia. The Soviets didn't fear the U.S. Army. They feared the invisible army they couldn't see. This was the ultimate irony of Gladio. A network designed to prevent war was almost the catalyst for the end of the world. The secret couldn't last forever. In 1984, an Italian judge named Felice Casson began investigating a cold case, a 1972 car bomb in Pietano that killed 3 carabinieri. For 12 years, the official story was that it was a communist attack. But Casson found the explosives. They were C4, a type only available to NATO. He found the detonators. He traced them to a secret cache. He realized the police had deliberately sabotaged the original investigation to protect the real killers. Imagine the judge sitting in a cold, fluorescent-lit archive in Rome. The walls are lined with thousands of dusty boxes. The silence is absolute, broken only by the sound of turning pages. He finds a document with a strange logo, a gladiator's sword. As he reads, he feels a cold chill that has nothing to do with the room's temperature. He realizes he is looking at the blueprint for a shadow government. He realizes that every terrorist attack he lived through in the 70s might have been a state-sponsored operation. His courage to follow the trail led to Andreotti's 1990 confession. But as Casson spoke to the press, he noticed cars following him. He heard clicks on his phone line. The shadow soldiers didn't like being brought into the light. What happens to a man who discovers the truth in a world built on lies? In Turkey, the secret didn't come out in a speech. It came out in a car crash. November 3, 1996, near the town of Susurluk. A Mercedes crashes into a truck. Inside the car are 4 people: a high-ranking police chief, a member of parliament, a beauty queen, and Abdullah Chatli, a notorious hitman and leader of an ultranationalist militant group who was wanted by Interpol for murder. In the trunk of the car, silenced pistols, fake passports, and a stash of drugs. The Susurluk scandal proved what everyone had suspected. The police, the politicians, and the shadow soldiers were all in the same car. The counter-guerrilla was real. It was active, and it was running the country. The people took to the streets. 1 minute of darkness for eternal light, they shouted, turning their lights off every night at 9 p.m. to protest the deep state. But the deep state didn't vanish. It simply moved deeper into the shadows. The climax of the Gladio saga is not a courtroom victory. It is a realization. In 1992, the European Parliament passed a resolution condemning the secret armies and demanding a full investigation. NATO refused to cooperate. The CIA refused to open its files. The shadow soldiers were never truly dismantled. In many countries, the networks were simply reorganized under new names. The weapons were moved. The files were burned. The tragedy of Gladio is that it proved that a democracy can host a dictatorship within its own body. It proved that in the name of security, a state is willing to sacrifice justice. The strategy of tension didn't end with the Cold War. It just evolved. Today, we live in a world of hybrid warfare and false flag accusations. Every time a mysterious explosion happens or a political leader is assassinated, the ghost of Gladio rises. The stay-behind armies were born out of a genuine fear of Soviet tyranny, but they became a tyranny of their own. They turned Europe into a chessboard where the pawns were the citizens themselves. We must ask ourselves, is the secret army still out there? Are there still crates of C4 buried under our parks? Or have the shadow soldiers moved into the digital world, fighting the strategy of tension with algorithms and bots? Gladio was the secret army of the West, but while NATO was building its stay-behind units, the Soviet Union was building something much more direct. They weren't just waiting for a war, they were trying to trigger one from the inside. What happens when a Soviet spy is planted at the very top of the West German government? How did a single man nearly bring down the entire European alliance without firing a single shot? That is a story for our next investigation, the Chancellor's Shadow, the Gunther Guillaume affair.